Yat esh Nicole Martin Yanisha, Tachitni Ninchla Kiasani Bushichi, Chijidushiche Kiasani Dushanale. Good evening, everyone. I introduced myself in the Nefbazad, which is the Navajo language. Maternally, I am red running into the water, born for a parrot clan from Parahi, which is a village, a part of Laguna, Pueblo. My maternal grandfather is Chiricahua Apache, and my paternal grandfather is Lizard Clan from Laguna Pueblo as well. And I just wanted to say, thank you for everyone for being here and for the land that we are guests on to be able to have this conversation with y'all. So, reproductive justice was a term coined, and this is their title, Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice. And they coined that term in 1994. However, reproductive justice and health for indigenous communities and in Black communities and for our LGBTQ femmes we've always been fighting since the arrival of colonization and their social structures. And so reproductive justice for indigenous communities is the advocacy for personal and community autonomy over their mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. Emphasis on protecting all five-fingered and non-five-fingered beings. Since colonial expansion, people indigenous to Turtle Island have been fighting to live their most authentic lives. Once white, cisgender, heterosexual males came to this land, they used every means of force to power, eventually placing policy as supreme law of the land in order to eradicate our existence. One policy that was mentioned earlier by my relative was, Andrew Jackson. He was known as being the Indian killer and the first president to completely say, fuck that, and just went and said, hey, I'm putting this Indian Removal Act, and this is the supreme law of the land, and we're gonna move the Cherokee, the Muskogee Creek, the Seminole, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw nations, as well as African slaves west for white supremacist consumption of the land and the opportunities that these savages weren't taking advantage of because we as indigenous people didn't get off on of capitalizing and consuming the land and the resources for personal consumption. We lived in abundance rather than scarcity, and so once colonization came, it was basically every man for himself. So you move forward on from the Indian Removal Act, and you go into the boarding school era. You go into, which was another form of militarization. It was based off of Carlyle, and his practices of putting people in dormitories, separating children into binaries of girls and boys, and with that, their curriculums were tailored to their gender, which was the girls would be put into domestic work and like home economic type work, and the boys would be put into trades work or vocational work. And so you see how they used assimilation to already enact the heteropatriarchy and white supremacist values that they were trying to use for power. And we see this still today with our education systems. We see this today with what the current administration is doing with our relatives in the South who are trying to seek asylum. And, taking children, ripping children away from their parents and their grandparents and their caretakers and putting them in unlivable conditions. And as indigenous people to this land, we know that's a colonial tactic for colonial warfare, and we know that they have always used that as an attack against our reproductive health and our rights and how we live as indigenous people to this land. And so our sentiments and everything that the Red Nation and the PFC does is to advocate for that, to advocate for the abolishment of settler colonialism, prison abolishment, detention camps, and also while advocating for the earth, because we know that, as Beata had mentioned, the extraction of our natural resources have enormous impacts on our reproductive health. And a lot of us rely on Indian Health Service, which is a federally run and funded part of the government. And we rely on that, but a lot of that access, especially if you're on Navajo Nation, there's only 5 IHS facilities, and Navajo Nation is like about 26,000 acres wide, and a lot of people barely even have cars. How are they going to make these appointments? How are they going to make sure that their physical, mental, emotional well-being can be checked on and helped with modern medicine when all of their traditional medicine has been destroyed and depleted because of natural extraction? And so we have to give into these consumer wages to figure out, how are we going to live? How are we going to continue for the future generations to come? And I wanted to say that I got into reproductive justice and health because I have personal stories for myself of sexual trauma and violence, and also being a perpetrator of sexual trauma and violence. And so having the ability to figure out how, on a personal level, to get away from these toxic social structures and to do the work that our ancestors have been doing since millennia is very transformative, and it puts you in a bigger scope of when you have the community that is also advocating for that too, that you're not alone. And I feel oftentimes when we talk about especially sex, gender, and sexuality in our communities, we feel alone because we have sexual violence and sexual trauma, so we don't know how to even have healthy communications about the things that have been done to us, the things that we've witnessed, and what we feel when we know that the land is being depleted before our eyes, and our plants and animals are also being affected by it too. And currently with I have heard stories for indigenous people who have been trying to seek access to abortion health care because they also are impacted by not only the violence that's happening to the land, but physical violence. We have high rates of sexual violence. A lot of our women go missing and murdered, and as well as our LGBT two-spirit relatives, and those are also direct attacks on our reproductive health and our sex, gender, and sexuality. And So when we look at the policies that try to help indigenous peoples today, knowing that this federal government, this United States federal government, has an obligation to the livelihood of indigenous peoples through a lot of the compacts, a lot of the binding compacts that they made in order to have the land that they do, is, we still have to advocate. We're still out there trying to make sure that we have access to reproductive health.
5 minutes.
Okay. And so often our spirits of the younger generations are brought into this world through violence. And I just want to uplift the Beata and the work they do, because the exposure to nuclear waste indigenous people endure is not valued. We are seen to the mainstream as disposable, because for those very reasons that you can still that people and with money can still come in and take over. As indigenous, sexuality should be healthy. It is one intersection of reproductive justice and health. Sexuality today is a topic not discussed in our homes. As indigenous communities, we are often targeted and preyed upon through the missing and murdered indigenous women in our LGBTQ two spirits going missing. This has been happening since colonization, and it's just a tactic of warfare, and the policies that we have in place, like the Hyde Amendment, that's a federal policy that doesn't fund abortion health care for people who are who use IHS, or for people who are in the military or federal employees. And so if you think about that, a lot of our relatives too have federal employee jobs, and the rates at which they also experience sexual violence is really high and unaccounted for because of the power dynamics and the job securities that they often have when they are a part of these jobs. And so some things like with abortion, healthcare, we often overlook that there are things that are out of our control that happen. And so some stories like ectopic pregnancies, which is a pregnancy where the fertilized egg implants outside of the uterus, and the fertilized egg cannot survive outside of the uterus. But if it continues to grow, it can cause serious body damage, or it can even cause death. And so when you think about the cancer exposure and all of the radiation exposures that leads to cancer, there are stories where our women aren't able to seek, procedures that are considered abortions, and it's really sad that we place values on bodies and people's autonomy to have choices over their own bodies at the expense of religion, at the expense of producing, being part of the producing consumerist, capitalist ways. And that's why I want to uplift and go off reproductive justice and health is all encompassing, and it's not just what our ancestors have also had to endure, it's what we're also currently enduring, and then what our future generations will endure will look totally different. But what we're out here doing is trying to make sure that our communities get to live their most authentic lives in the most beautiful and loving ways. Thank you.
Yeah.